Greetings, traveler of the night. My name is Milo, and tonight I am here gently beside you. Not to instruct, not to fix, but simply to accompany you, as a long day finally comes to a close. Have you ever wondered why we can feel so intensely drawn to someone almost instantly, and then find that very attraction becoming the source of pain, disappointment, and collapse? Carl Gustav Jung believed this was no accident. It is the Anima speaking. In this video, we will step together into a profound inner journey, one where attraction, love, and pain are no longer seen as personal mistakes, but as messages rising from the unconscious. Jung called this projection the act of projecting. When we fall in love, very often, we are not loving the real person standing before us, but a part of our own soul that has not yet been recognized. If you have ever fallen in love too quickly, expected too much, or felt disappointed because they changed, then perhaps the issue does not lie with them. It lies with the anima, the inner feminine image quietly shaping how you see, feel, and desire. This long video is not meant to teach you how to love better in the self-help sense. It invites you to understand yourself more deeply, so that attraction no longer becomes an unconscious trap, but a doorway leading toward inner maturity. And when night falls, when consciousness grows weary, this is also when the anima is most easily heard. Let this voice accompany you to understand, to release, and finally to sink into a deeper, more peaceful sleep. Allow yourself to relax. Allow yourself to listen, and let the anima speak as you slowly drift into sleep. You are enough, and you have always been enough. Part 1. The threshold of the night. Night is one of the rare moments when human beings no longer have to brace themselves to appear strong. As the light softens, as the noise of the outer world gradually fades, another door begins to open, a door leading into a territory we usually avoid during the day. Jung called it the realm of the unconscious. And at this threshold, there is always a silent presence waiting to be recognized, the anima. The anima is not loud. She does not demand. She only whispers, like a thin breeze gliding gently across the surface of a still lake. Jung once referred to the root animos, meaning breath, the living wind. The anima is that breath within the soul of a man. She is the principle of eros, of connection, emotion, the capacity to be moved, sleeping quietly behind the rigid mask of logos that society compels one to wear in order to survive. By day, a man is taught to control, to analyze, to be rational, to conquer. But when night falls, when numbers, goals, and social roles slip from his shoulders, what remains is not strength, but a longing to feel, to be touched, to be understood. And that is precisely when the Anima begins to speak. Carl Jung once wrote a sentence so brief yet powerful enough to shake an entire lifetime. The Anima is not the soul in the dogmatic sense, not an intellectual abstraction, but something that can be experienced. Collected Works of C.G. Jung, Volume 9, Part 1. The Anima is not a concept to be understood. She is an experience to be allowed. And so, right here at this threshold, Jung does not invite us to think more. He invites us to let go. To let go of our habitual attempt to grasp everything with the mind. To let go of the need to define, categorize, and explain. Here, sharp rationality is no longer the appropriate tool. Only symbols know the way through the dark. Imagine the Anima as a rocking motion, like a cradle. That rhythm does not push you forward. It gently carries you backward, away from the voice of the controlling ego, away from the world of achievement and comparison, back to the place where neglected emotions are quietly waiting to be touched. This is not weakness. It is a return. Jung once warned, one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. Collected Works of C.G. Jung, Volume 13. The threshold of the night is not a place to escape the light. It is the place where the light has never reached. And the Anima is the only guide who can walk there, not through commands, not through theory, but through feeling, through images, through subtle vibrations that daylight has trained us to ignore. In a society that glorifies logos, the Anima is often misunderstood as soft, irrational, even dangerous. But Jung saw her differently. He saw in the Anima not merely femininity, but the capacity that gives life its soul. When the Anima is denied, a person may still succeed, but it is a success lived in dryness. When the Anima is heard, life may not become perfect, but it begins to feel alive with meaning. And so, at this very moment, before the journey moves deeper, the most important thing is not to understand what the anima is. What matters is to allow her presence, to allow yourself to no longer be stronger, no longer be more correct, no longer be better, only to be quiet enough to hear an ancient call echoing from within. Jung once said, "Who looks outside dreams. Who looks inside awakes." Collected Works of C.G. Jung, Volume 10. But this awakening is not an awakening to act. It is a different kind of awakening. An awakening to let go. An awakening to cross the threshold of the night without carrying the weapons of the day. And there, in that dim, symbolic realm, the anima is waiting, not to teach you something new, but to remind you of a part of your soul you once knew and have forgotten for far too long. If you are listening to these words at night, let the voice be only a gentle current. There is no need to remember, no need to understand everything. Simply allow it to carry you across this threshold. The rest the anima will take care of, and we will move on to the next part. Part 2. The illusion of love at first sight. And then, just as you step across the threshold of the night, just as the shell of rational control begins to soften, a very familiar memory, often quietly, rises. It does not need to be named. It arrives on its own. A glance, a moment, a sensation that surges too quickly, too powerfully, as if something sacred has just been awakened. That man looks at you, and in his gaze, you are no longer just a person. You are his entire world. Do you remember the way he looked at you, as if he had finally found the one? The way he said he had never felt anything like this before. The way you were placed upon an invisible pedestal where you were both worshipped and slowly imprisoned. The pain does not appear immediately. At first, the feeling is sweet, deeply intoxicating. It makes you believe you are seen, chosen, desired in a complete and absolute way. But Jung would pause at this very moment and say something difficult to hear. In love at first sight, very often, no one is truly being seen at all. Carl Jung called this phenomenon projection. He wrote, "The projection carries the image of the anima out into the world and makes it appear there as though it belonged to the object." Collected Works of C.G. Jung, Volume 9, Part 2. In other words, in the moment a man becomes so enamored with you that he loses his sense of direction. It is quite possible that he is not loving you at all. He is loving his own inner anima, reflected onto you like a flawless mirror. And you, without realizing it, have been pulled into the role of a living symbol. Here is where the pain begins to take shape. Not because you have done something wrong, but because you are being loved, not as a real human being. You are being loved as an idea, a muse, a goddess, a promise of salvation for the feminine part starved within that man's soul. Jung warned very clearly, where love rules, there is no will to power, and where power predominates love is lacking. Collected Works of C.G. Jung, Volume 7. In projected love, power does not appear as overt control, but as invisible expectation. You are expected to always be gentle, always understanding, always supportive, always special. And the most cruel part lies here. You are not allowed to be tired, not allowed to crack, not allowed to be an ordinary woman with limits, shadows, and ease of weakness. Your burden is to maintain the illusion, not for yourself, but for the undeveloped soul of another. And when you slip from that pedestal, even once, one moment of exhaustion, one unmet expectation, one time you say, "I can't," the gaze begins to change. Infatuation turns into disappointment. Idealization turns into resentment. Not because you have changed, but because the illusion has collapsed. Jung described this moment with a cold clarity. Every projection is a partial possession. Collected Works of C.G. Jung, Volume 6. You are possessed not through violence, but through images. You become the place where another deposits the part of their soul they do not dare to face. And the deepest pain for a woman in projected love is not abandonment, but never having truly been met at all. At a deeper level, Jung saw in this phenomenon not only a romantic tragedy, but a spiritual conflict. When the anima has been repressed too long within a man, she seeks escape by fastening herself onto a real woman. But this does not liberate her. It only creates a new prison, this time for both. And here, something very important must be said. Clearly, this pain is not your fault. Jung never blamed women in the phenomenon of projection. On the contrary, he saw them as those who bear the consequences of an unconscious process they never chose. For this reason, The first step toward healing is not to close the heart, but to look directly at the truth without condemning yourself. To understand that being placed on a pedestal is not proof of your worth, and being pulled down from it is not proof of your inadequacy. Jung once said something quietly devastating. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. Collected Works of C.G. Jung, Volume 10. In Love at First Sight, many people call their pain destiny, but Jung called it an unrecognized invitation. An invitation for both people to turn back and face the forgotten parts of their own souls, rather than placing them on the shoulders of another. And if at this moment, as you listen to these words in the night, you feel a very old sadness gently rising, know that it is not here to wound you further. It is a sign that you are slowly stepping out of the role of an illusion. We will not remain in this pain. But before moving on, allow yourself to stay here for a moment. Not to blame anyone, not to fix anything. Simply to acknowledge I was once loved for an image, not for my real self. And from that painful point of contact, the journey of transformation truly begins. And the next part will follow right after this. Part 3. The Mask and the Soul. After the pain of illusion has been named after you have allowed yourself to acknowledge that there were loves that never truly touched your real self, a natural pause appears. This pause is essential, because if we remain here long enough, pain no longer demands to be explained. It begins to ask to be understood. And it is precisely at this point that Jungian knowledge does not enter as a judgment, but as a hand gently resting on the shoulder, whispering softly, "This is not because you lack worth." Carl Jung viewed projection not as a moral failure, but as a natural compensatory mechanism of the psyche. When a person is forced to live too long within a single role, the rejected part will seek every possible way to reveal itself, even through the most painful paths. The more a man tries to live entirely within the persona, the social mask of strength, rationality, control, masculinity, the more its opposite, the anima, is pushed deeper into the shadows. And what is buried for too long does not become gentle. It becomes volatile, easily wounded, easily explosive, easily possessive. Jung wrote clearly, "The persona is a kind of mask designed on the one hand to make a definite impression upon others, and on the other, to conceal the true nature of the individual. Collected Works of C.G. Jung, Volume 7. The persona is not falsehood. It is necessary for survival in society. But when a person fully identifies with the mask, they lose the ability to listen to their own soul. And then the anima can no longer live within. She is forced to seek a place outside. That is when you appear in their life. Not because you are more special than everyone else, but because you touch precisely the image their anima longs to see. You become the place where their starved soul attempts to take refuge. And for that reason, the expectations placed upon you are no longer personal. They become matters of psychological survival. Understanding this, a subtle transformation begins to unfold. You gradually realize that irrational demands, disproportionate reactions, excessive anger are not attacks on your worth. They are cries for help from a soul that does not yet know how to hold itself. Jung once said something essential. Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. Collected Works of C.G. Jung, Volume 10. But in this case, the reverse is also true. What others demand excessively from you is very often what they cannot yet give themselves. When a man demands that you always be gentle, he is avoiding the gentleness within himself. When he needs you to be a constant emotional support, it is because he has not learned how to stay with his own emotions. And here, something crucial must be spoken to soothe your deepest pain. You are not obligated to save anyone's soul. Jung never assigned women the role of men's salvation. On the contrary, he warned that when the anima is completely projected outward, both sides become trapped in a relationship without inner freedom. Projection is an unconscious, automatic process whereby a subjective content is transferred to an object. Collected Works of C.G. Jung, Volume 6. When you understand that projection is unconscious, you can finally lay down a very old burden. The burden of asking, "What did I do wrong?" It is very possible that the answer is nothing at all. What you experienced was not a failure in love, but a point of collision between the persona and the soul, between what a person tries to be and what they truly are. And that collision, though painful, carries within it a seed of transformation. Jungian philosophy does not ask you to return, nor does it advise you to leave. It simply invites you to change your inner position from the one being projected upon to the one observing the process of projection. From there, you can begin to distinguish between genuine meeting and unconscious compensation. Jung wrote, "The meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there is any reaction, both are transformed." Collected. Works of C.G. Jung, Volume 7. But transformation occurs only when each person takes responsibility for their own soul. When a man begins to confront his inner anima, you no longer have to carry the weight of his emotional immaturity. And then a very basic right is returned to you, the right to be an imperfect human being. If at this moment, as you listen to these words in the night, you feel your heart soften just a little, that is a sign that knowledge is no longer merely theory. It has begun to soothe, not by denying pain, but by placing it in its rightful position within the larger landscape of the human soul. We have not yet reached dissolution. We have not yet entered the deep unconscious. But from this point onward, you are no longer standing in the shadow of self-blame. You are standing on new ground where pain begins to hold meaning and the soul begins to breathe. And as that breathing becomes steadier, we will continue more lightly into deeper regions of the unconscious, where the figures no longer frighten you, but quietly invite you to rest. And we will move on to the next part. Part 4. The Cave of Fading Figures. And when pain has been placed back in its rightful position, when you no longer need to defend yourself against the questions of why and where did I go wrong, a very different kind of fatigue begins to spread through the body. Not the exhaustion of injury, but the weariness of having remained alert for far too long. This, Jung said, is precisely the moment when consciousness is meant to step back. There is no need to understand anything more. Knowledge has completed its task. Now, what is being invited is not thinking, but drifting. Allow your shoulders to drop as if someone has gently removed an invisible coat you have been wearing all day. Your breath slows. Your heart no longer has to prove anything. And before you, in the space of imagination, an ancient image appears a cave. Not a cave of fear, not a temporary shelter, but a primordial cave, a symbol that has lived in the human unconscious since before language existed. Jung saw the cave as the womb of the soul, where life is gestated in darkness before emerging into the light. The cave is a place of transformation where the old consciousness dissolves and something new is born. Collected Works of C.G. Jung, Volume 5. Inside this cave, there are no sharp stone walls. There is only a vast, dark ocean, stretching endlessly, the collective unconscious. It does not threaten. It holds. It has been there far longer than you have had a name, long before you learned to distinguish right from wrong, strong from weak, male from female. Upon the surface of the water, the full moon reflects silently. Jung regarded the moon as the eternal symbol of the feminine, of cycles of receptivity, of the capacity to contain without controlling. Moonlight does not shine to illuminate a path. It shines to soothe. And in this moment, you are no longer standing outside observing. You feel your body growing lighter. Familiar boundaries begin to blur. You do not need to hold a posture. You do not need to define who you are. You are simply a drop of water, a drop dissolving into the wave. There is no longer me and the other, no role to carry, no gender to perform, only the current of life supporting you from below, as if your entire nervous system is finally allowed to rest. Jung once wrote, "In the unconscious, all things are linked together by a universal sympathy." Collected Works of C.G. Jung, Volume 8. In the unconscious, there is no division. What is separated? During the day, reason and emotion, strength and vulnerability, masculine and feminine, here melts together naturally. No reconciliation is required. No effort is needed. Only release. You are not dissolving. You are being held. If in earlier parts the Anima appeared as an image, a voice, a call here, she no longer needs a form. She becomes the environment, the water, the darkness, the rhythm, the gentle repetition of waves, like the very first heartbeat you ever heard before you knew what fear was. Jung called this state regression in the service of the ego, a return not to escape, but to restore. Regression is not in itself a bad thing. It only becomes harmful when it is prolonged and one-sided. Collected Works of C.G. Jung, Volume 6. Here you are not being pulled backward. You are being brought home. Home to where the nervous system does not need to stay vigilant. Home to where emotions do not need justification. Home to where the soul breathes with the rhythm of the universe rather than the rhythm of expectation. In the darkness of the cave, fading figures begin to pass by, indistinct, unnamed. They are memories that never found words, emotions that were never allowed to exist, parts of you left behind when you had to grow up too soon. But unlike the daylight world here, these figures do not need to be explained. They only need to be allowed to pass. And each time you do not grasp, do not analyze, do not resist, your nervous system relearns its most ancient lesson. I am safe. Jung once spoke a sentence very softly, yet profoundly. The unconscious is not just evil by nature. It is also the source of the highest good. Collected Works of C.G. Jung, Volume 13. In this dark ocean, there is nothing to fix, nothing to perfect. You do not need to become someone else. You only need to remain long enough to feel that even in darkness, life continues to move with gentleness. If your eyelids now feel a little heavier, if thoughts begin to thin, if the voice seems to drift farther away, this is not distraction. It is consciousness completing its task and quietly handing over guidance to a deeper intelligence. We will not rush out of this cave. Here there is no clock, no destination, only the slow rocking of the current carrying you deeper into an ancient rhythm you once knew long before you learned how to strive. And when you drift deeply enough, the images that follow will no longer arise from pain, but from the healing instinct of the unconscious itself. Part 5. Eve and Helen. Instinct and beauty. And then, as you dissolve into the current of the unconscious, when body and consciousness no longer struggle to maintain control, the images that follow are no longer abstract. They become concrete, intimate, and because of that, more painful. From the depths of that dark ocean, two familiar figures slowly rise, not as fairy tale characters, but as psychological patterns that have repeated themselves for thousands of years in human history. Jung called them Eve and Helen, two crucial yet incomplete stages in the development of the anima within a man. When a man is trapped at the level of Eve, he sees the woman before him primarily as a source of nourishment. You become the place where he feels cared for, soothed, filled in his most primitive emotional lacks. At this level, love carries the color of instinct. It needs you, but it does not truly know you. Jung described this stage as being dominated by biological instinct and primal needs for safety. At this stage, the anima is essentially a mother image. Collected Works of C.G. Jung, Volume 9, Part 2. And your pain in the role of Eve lies here. You are needed, but not met. You are loved for your capacity to give, not for the depth of who you are. Each time you grow tired, each time you are no longer endlessly gentle, each time you need to be cared for. In return, the connection begins to fracture. But when a man leaves Eve without truly maturing, he very often falls straight into the opposite extreme. Helen. Helen is not a woman of flesh and blood. Helen is idealized beauty, the muse, a symbol of desire, of conquest, of the elevation of the ego. At this level, you are no longer used for nourishment. You are used to reflect their worth. Jung wrote clearly about Helen. Helen represents a seductive aesthetic anima figure, inspiring romantic longing, but lacking moral substance. Collected Works of C.G. Jung, Volume 9, Part 2. In the role of Helen, you are admired, praised, pursued, but at the same time, you are stripped of the right to be complex. You must be beautiful, exceptional, extraordinary, and most of all, you must always live up to the image they have constructed. The pain here is sharper than the pain of Eve, because as Helen, you are not only misunderstood, you are reduced to a surface, a symbol, a dream to be conquered. And Helen's loneliness does not come from the absence of love, but from the fact that no one truly remains when you step out of the role. Perhaps you have felt this before: desired, but not known, praised, but not touched, looked at, but not stayed with. Jung once said something very direct. The anima is a factor of the greatest importance in the psychology of man, but she is often projected and therefore not consciously experienced. Collected Works of C.G. Jung, Volume 9, Part 1. When the anima has not yet been made conscious, the woman is forced to carry her image, and the cost of this is existential loneliness. The loneliness of knowing that you are far deeper than the way you are being seen. What must be said so that this pain does not harden into bitterness is this: Eve and Helen are not wrong images. they are unfinished stages. The man who is trapped there is not driven by malice, but by an inner lack of safety that prevents him from going further. And for this very reason, your pain is not proof that you are not enough. It is proof that you have already gone beyond the patterns they are capable of holding. Jung saw in this disillusionment an opportunity for transformation. The psychological rule says that when an inner situation is not made conscious, it happens outside as fate. Collected Works of C.G. Jung, Volume 8. When you are repeatedly placed in the role of Eve or Helen, this is not your romantic destiny. It is a sign that you are standing at the threshold of a deeper level, where meeting no longer rests on instinct or image, but on the recognition of each other as whole human beings. But before reaching that level, this pain must be fully felt, without avoidance, because only when you allow yourself to name the insult, the shallowness, the sharp loneliness, do you stop shrinking yourself to fit someone else's frame. If at this moment, as you listen to these words in the night, you feel a very still sadness spreading, know that this is not despair. It is clarity beginning to form, a clarity that needs no anger, no accusation, only a quiet recognition. I am deeper than this. And from that recognition, another path begins to open. A path Jung called the transformation of Eros, where the Anima no longer stops at Eve or Helen, but continues toward more mature forms. But before we step onto that next level, allow yourself to remain here a little longer, not to blame anyone, only to acknowledge this pain is real and it has meaning. Part 6. The Ladder of Transformation. After the pain of Eve and Helen has been named after, you have allowed yourself to acknowledge the feeling of being diminished, idealized, and forgotten within the very admiration directed toward you. A different kind of fatigue emerges. It is no longer the exhaustion of injury, but the weariness of repetition, tired of stepping into familiar frames, tired of carrying roles that have grown old. It is precisely at this point of weariness that Jung saw the possibility of transformation. In analytical psychology, Jung described the development of the Anima as a ladder of Eros, a process that does not unfold through willpower, but through inner ripening. Eve and Helen are not wrong turns. They are the first steps. But if one remains there too long, love becomes a burden for both sides. when illusions begin to dissolve, when possession and idealization are no longer enough to fill the inner void, a quiet question arises within the man. What am I seeking beyond being nourished or admired? If this question is allowed to remain long enough, it opens the next rung of the ladder. Jung called this rung Mary. Mary is not a new idealization. She is not the radiant muse, nor the enveloping mother. Mary is the image of reverence of an eros that restrains instinct in order to open toward moral depth. At this stage, the man begins to see the woman not merely as a source of fulfillment, but as a human being with an independent inner life. Jung wrote, Mary represents a figure of spiritual devotion, where erotic desire is transformed into reverence. Collected Works of C.G. Jung, Volume 9, Part 2. But even Mary is not the destination, for if one stops there, the woman once again risks being placed upon another pedestal, the pedestal of sacrifice, purity of the ideal woman in a moral sense. And once more, you are loved for a role, not for the wholeness of who you are. Transformation is completed only when eros continues upward to the final rung, Sophia. Sophia is not the perfect woman. She is living wisdom, the capacity to see and accept the many-sided, contradictory, unfinished nature of the human being. At Sophia, love is no longer possession, nor is it worship. It becomes a meeting between two free subjects. Jung described this moment as a fundamental shift in eros, the transformation of libido from instinctual attachment to conscious relatedness marks a decisive step in individuation. Collected Works of C.G. Jung, Volume 8. At the level of Sophia, the man no longer needs you as a source of nourishment, nor as a symbol to elevate the ego. He begins to confront the anima within himself, and therefore gains the capacity to meet you outwardly as a real human being, not to use, not to save, but to enter into dialogue. And here, an essential consolation is returned to you. You do not need to be a saint. Jung never placed the burden of transformation upon the woman's shoulders. On the contrary, he emphasized that each person must walk their own path of individuation. You are not required to lead anyone through sacrifice. You need only to remain present in your own truth. That presence, unhidden, unshrunken, unembellished, is what truly has the power to illuminate. Jung said this very clearly. individuation does not shut one out from the world, but gathers the world to oneself. Collected works of C. G. Jung, Volume 7. When Eros matures into Sophia, love is no longer a place where you must trade yourself in order to remain. It becomes a space where both can bring their whole selves without carving away parts to fit a mold. And the paradox lies here only when you stop trying to lead anyone do you truly become capable of opening a path. The ladder of transformation does not promise that every relationship will reach Sophia. Jung was realistic. But it restores a deeper peace. You no longer need to ask what more you must do to be loved in the right way. Your task is not to support another's process, but to remain faithful to the depth of your own being. Jung once wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." Collected Works of C.G. Jung, Volume 17. When you stand firmly within that privilege, relationships that cannot walk with you will naturally fall away, not as punishment, but as a natural filtration. And relationships capable of meeting at the level of Sophia will require few promises. They are recognized by a very quiet feeling. No one has to strain anymore. If at this moment, as you listen to these words in the night, you feel your chest lighten just a little, that is the sign of genuine consolation. Not consolation born of hope, but of understanding placed in its proper context. Understanding that the pain of Eve and Helen was not the end, but a necessary rung for Eros to mature. And when that understanding grows deep enough, there is no need to hurry forward. You only need to remain within the calm that has just begun to form. For from here on, the journey will continue not through knowledge, but through the living experience of deeper images where the unconscious begins to speak in symbols. And it is there that the movements which follow will no longer wound you, but will carry you into a slower, deeper breathing of the soul. Part 7. The Dance of the Inner Beasts. And then, when Eros has climbed beyond the final rungs of understanding, when you no longer need to distinguish right from wrong, mature from immature, when even the very concept of transformation begins to feel unnecessary, a very deep silence opens. Not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of the earth, before life begins to stir. At this point, Jung would say nothing more. He would step back, because from here on, the soul no longer speaks in concepts. It speaks in images, in movement, in creatures older than language itself. In the dream that is now forming, you do not need to try to imagine. The images arrive on their own very slowly, very naturally, as if they have always been there, simply waiting for you to become quiet enough to see them. First, a lion appears. It does not roar. It does not threaten. It simply stands there, grounded heavy, with a deep and steady breath. Jung saw the lion as a symbol of instinctual life that has been tamed of strength that no longer needs to prove itself. This lion does not protect you from the outer world. It protects the inner kingdom, the place where you no longer need permission to exist. Jung once wrote, "Instincts are living forces which do not require justification, but must be allowed to live." Collected Works of C.G. Jung, Volume 8. The lion represents instinct that has been reconciled, no longer repressed, no longer erupting. It reminds your nervous system of a very ancient feeling. I am safe within my own territory. And when that sense of safety becomes firm enough, subtler movements begin to appear. A butterfly gently flutters its wings, not hurried, not dazzling. Its wings are still damp, as if it has just emerged from the cocoon of social expectations, of roles that once confined you within an image of what you must be. Jung used the image of the butterfly to speak of psyche, the soul, the most fragile part, and yet the part most capable of profound transformation. The psyche is not a tabula rasa, but a living structure with its own laws. Collected Works of C.G. Jung, Volume 6. The butterfly does not need encouragement. It only needs not to be touched too soon. And in this dream, no one urges it to fly. It slowly tests its wings, relearning its own rhythm, a rhythm no longer dictated by the gaze of others. And then, from the cool ground, a very slow movement unfolds. A green snake coils and glides, not aggressive, not mysterious in a threatening way, just continuous movement, patient, ancient, full of memory. Jung saw the snake as one of the oldest symbols of instinctual wisdom and renewal. It sheds its skin not to become someone else, but to continue being itself. Jung wrote, "The snake symbolizes the life force that renews itself through transformation." Collected Works of C.G. Jung, Volume 9. Part 1. The snake does not speak. It does not need to. Its movement alone is reminder enough. Life does not move in straight lines. It moves in spirals. And each time you return to an old place, you are no longer the same person. In this dream, the lion does not stand apart from the butterfly. The butterfly does not fear the snake. The snake does not need to claim territory. They coexist as different aspects of the same soul, finally allowed to share one space. Jung called this state conjunctio, the non-oppositional union of the psyche's polarities. The goal of the psychic process is the self, and the self is the union of opposites. Collected. Works of C.G. Jung, Volume 14. Here there is no longer a battle between instinct and consciousness, no conflict between strength and fragility, no need to choose a role in order to exist. Everything moves together in a slow dance, guided by the deep breathing rhythm of the unconscious. And at this moment, something essential happens. You are no longer standing outside observing. You are no longer the one imagining these creatures. You are the space in which they move, the land where the lion rests, the air in which the butterfly tests its wings, the cool ground over which the snake glides. If your eyelids now feel heavier, if thoughts no longer form complete sentences, if your sense of time begins to dissolve, this is not distraction. It is consciousness withdrawing in a healthy way. Jung once said, "Dreams are the guiding words of the soul." Collected Works of C.G. Jung, Volume 10. And in this dream, those words do not need to be understood. They only need to be allowed to happen. No analysis, no remembering, no carrying them back into daylight. Just let them do what they have always known how to do, guide you into absolute stillness. In that place, there is no longer the question, "Am I enough?" No longer the fear, "Will I be left behind?" There is only the steady rhythm of life itself, moving very deep, very slow, very certain, even while you sleep. And as the dance of the inner beasts continues, without needing your attention, without needing your control, you may allow yourself to drift even farther, to where images begin to fade, to where sleep is no longer a goal, but the natural result of inner harmony. Part 8. When the soul is possessed. And then, even in the deepest dream, where everything seems to have come into harmony, at times, a restless movement still slips in. Not loudly at first. Just a very slight misalignment, like a once still surface of water, suddenly rippling with a ring whose source is unclear. In that dreamlike space, the lion is still there. The butterfly still flutters. The snake still glides slowly. Yet something no longer fits. A childlike energy, unpredictable, fragile, easily wounded, begins to intrude upon what had been a harmonious dance. And it is precisely at this moment that Jung would quietly speak a word many have felt but never named: possession. Not possession in the romantic sense, not passionate love, but possession by an unconscious part that has never been allowed to live in its proper place. At times, you can see this very clearly in the man beside you. He suddenly becomes petulant like a child, overreacts to trivial matters, withdraws into silence, then erupts in corrosive, harmful words. Dialogue disappears. Only emotion overflowing remains. Jung called this state Anima possession, when the inner feminine has been repressed for too long, not made conscious, not contained, and finally takes over the entire personality. At that point, the man no longer has emotions. He is emotion. Jung wrote bluntly, "Emotion is the chief source of all becoming conscious." Collected Works of C.G. Jung, Volume 8. But when emotion is not made conscious, it does not lead to awakening. It leads to chaos. And your pain in this state is not only the pain of being hurt by words or actions. The deeper pain lies in the role you are pushed into, the role of the mother, the soother, the one who must calm, understand, feel, and carry emotional storms that were never meant to be yours. You are not meeting a man. You are confronting a wounded child in an adult body. Jung never romanticized this condition. He saw possession as a dangerous state of the psyche, because consciousness has been stripped of its guiding role, and those nearby become unintended victims. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. Collected Works of C.G. Jung, Volume 10. In Anima possession. Many people call this chaos personality trauma or intense love, but Jung called it by its true name, the unconscious at the helm. And the prompt of that unconsciousness is very often paid by the woman. You become the dumping ground, the place of attachment, the sight of endless demands. And the most painful part is this: if you leave, you are accused of cruelty. If you stay, you slowly lose yourself. This is the vortex many women have passed through, yet rarely has it been named in language deep enough to reveal it. Jung saw here a tragedy born not of malice, but of psychological immaturity. When a man does not dare to enter the depth of his own emotional life, the anima does not disappear. She demands the right to live, and she lives through moodiness, dependency, through childlike demands disguised as love. Something crucial must be said, so that this pain does not turn into self-blame. You did not cause this state of possession, and you do not have the power to heal it through sacrifice. Jung never placed the responsibility of integrating the anima on the woman's shoulders. On the contrary, he emphasized that each person must confront their own unconscious. Otherwise, it will spill outward like a flood. And here, a boundary that must be restored within your soul. Compassion is not the same as endurance. Understanding that anima possession is a psychological process does not mean you must become its container. If in Part 7, the inner beasts coexisted in harmony, then in Part 8, one of those creatures has been starved for too long, and now it seizes dominance, not to destroy, but to be seen. Yet without conscious guidance, that being seen will always arrive hand in hand with rupture. And this is where your pain needs to be placed correctly, not as a failure in love, but as the limit of companionship. Jung called this the moment when the soul must say enough, not in anger, but in clarity. If right now, as you hear these words in the night, you feel a familiar heaviness in your chest, know that this is not a sign you are being pulled back into old pain. It is a sign that you are recognizing what was once invisible. Recognition, not to blame. Recognition, not to fix, but to return responsibility to where it truly belongs. And when that responsibility is returned, something very quiet, yet very important occurs. You no longer have to play the role of mother to a soul that refuses to grow. You begin to withdraw your energy, not as punishment, but as an act of self-preservation. We will not remain long in this chaos. Jung never advised lingering too long in darkness. But before moving on, this pain must be named correctly so that it no longer operates in silence. And once the name has been set down, the path ahead will no longer lead into chaos, but open into another possibility of freedom, where the anima no longer possesses, but becomes the guide. Part 9. Sophia, the light of freedom. And then, after the chaos of possession has been named after you, no longer have to carry on your shoulders emotional storms that were never yours. A very particular stillness begins to appear. Not the tense silence of waiting, but the silence after a storm, when the air is still damp, the earth still warm, and the sky slowly begins to open. Jung believed that no storm is meaningless. Every time the soul is torn, every time a relationship breaks apart, it is not to punish, but to reveal what must be seen. And when that truth is seen deeply enough, the anima, once the source of chaos, begins to change form. No longer a projected muse, no longer an angry, possessive child, no longer an image you are forced to carry. When a man courageously turns back to face the feminine within himself, without fleeing, without placing it upon another, the anima no longer needs to scream through emotion. She becomes Sophia. Sophia is not a particular woman. She is living wisdom, the capacity to see through illusion, to distinguish between love and possession, between connection and dependence. Jung called this form of the anima, the psychopomp, the guide of the soul. The anima becomes the guide or psychopomp to the unconscious. Collected works of C. G. Jung, Volume 9, Part 1. When the anima becomes Sophia, something essential happens. Projection comes to an end. No one has to carry another's image. No one has to live out another's unfinished development. Each person is returned to their rightful place as a free subject. And in that very moment, you, the woman who has endured too many roles, are given back a rare gift, the right to be yourself, no longer needing to be gentle to keep the peace, no longer needing to be strong in order not to be abandoned, no longer needing to understand for feel for or endure for another. Jung understood this freedom not as separation, but as right relationship. He wrote, "Freedom is not the absence of commitment, but the ability to choose oneself within it." Collected Works of C.G. Jung, Volume 10. At the level of Sophia, love is no longer the dissolution of the ego. It is the meeting of two egos that can stand on their own. And the paradox lies here only when we no longer need one another to be complete do we truly become capable of companionship. The fractures you have endured, seen in this light, are no longer signs of failure. They become invitations, an invitation for each person to enter what Jung called individuation, the journey of becoming one's whole self. Jung wrote a famous line, "Individuation means becoming an individual, and insofar as individuality embraces our innermost, last and incomparable uniqueness, it also implies becoming one's own self." Collected Works of C.G. Jung, Volume 7. Seen from this perspective, you may recognize that many relationships did not end because of a lack of love, but because both were being invited to go further and were not yet ready. And that ending, painful as it was, performed a necessary task. It liberated. It liberated you from the role of the mother. It liberated them from the illusion of being saved. It liberated the relationship from having to exist through sacrifice. Sophia does not arrive with promises that everything will be fine. She arrives with a deeper truth. Everything has meaning, even what does not stay. And that understanding is the true light, not blinding, not coercive, but sufficient to show the way. Jung once said, "Wholeness is not achieved by cutting off a portion of one's being, but by integration of the contraries." Collected Works of C.G. Jung, Volume 14. The freedom Sophia brings is not the freedom to abandon everything, but the freedom of no longer being driven by the unconscious, no longer being pulled into familiar relationships simply because they resemble old wounds, no longer confusing intensity with connection. And at this level, something very gentle occurs. You no longer need to understand anyone further. You have understood enough. Enough to let go. Enough to not return to old roles. Enough to allow quiet to enter places that were once very loud. If right now, as you listen to these words in the night, you feel your chest open just a little, no excitement, no intense hope, just calm, then that is the sign of Sophia. She does not arrive like lightning. She arrives like morning light, bright enough to wake you, gentle enough to let you fall back asleep. We will not linger here for long. This light does not need to be held. It only needs to be recognized and then allowed to continue illuminating from within. And when Sophia has taken her rightful place without possession, without judgment, without guiding through fear, the soul begins to prepare for another movement. A movement no longer of understanding, but of the rebirth of images. But before moving on, allow yourself to remain in this gentle light a little longer. No thinking, no deciding, just feeling freedom as a natural state, not something to be achieved. And from that very calm, the images that follow will no longer speak of pain, but of the birth of beauty. Finally, set free. Part 10. The Birth of Venus. And then, when the light of Sophia has completed its guiding role, when there is nothing more you need to understand, that light begins to soften. It does not disappear. It simply recedes, like the sun after sunset, making space for another kind of light, the light of beauty that needs no reason. At this moment, Jung would no longer speak of processes of individuation or of opposites. He knew that if one went further through concepts, the soul would awaken. And so he allows the final symbol of healing to appear not as a lesson, but as an image. Let your imagination open very slowly. You do not need to imagine in the sense of effortfully forming an image. This image has lived in the collective unconscious for centuries. It only needs to be remembered. A calm sea, white foam, pure and luminous. And from it, Venus slowly emerges, standing upon a shell, naked, unhidden, undefended. Not the nakedness of exposure, but the nakedness of having nothing left to hide. Jung did not see this image as an erotic symbol, but as the rebirth of a purified eros, an eros no longer possessed, no longer idealized, no longer bound to roles. What remains is beauty as a natural state of being. Jung once wrote, "Beauty is the form under which the soul experiences life as meaningful." Collected Works of C.G. Jung, Volume 15. Venus does not step forth to be admired. She steps forth because the time has come. No one calls, no one waits, no one possesses. She appears as life has always appeared when conditions are sufficient, without requiring the permission of reason. And within this image, something very subtle occurs. You are no longer standing outside looking at her. You are her. Not in the sense of identifying yourself with a lofty symbol, but in a very gentle sense, the beauty within you, once suppressed, once used, once placed upon pedestals or dragged into the mud, is returned to its primordial state, not to attract anyone, not to heal anyone, not to prove anything, only to exist, You feel the cool water touching your feet, not shocking, not biting, just enough for the nervous system to recognize I am being renewed. The sea salt gently washes away the fatigue that has clung to you through a lifetime of carrying roles, expectations, the emotional responsibilities of others. Here there is no longer a need to be strong, no longer a need to understand, no longer a need to endure. There is only being. Jung once said quietly, "The soul has its own peculiar way of knowing." Collected Works of C.G. Jung, Volume 11. And the soul's way of knowing in this moment does not come from thinking. It comes from the pleasant sensation spreading through the body when you no longer have to brace yourself. From the softening of the jaw, the shoulders, the belly. From the slowing of the breath that you do not need to control. Venus carries no message. She carries a climate, the climate of unconditional compassion, the climate of beauty that demands no return, the climate where you do not need to become someone else in order to deserve existence. Within this climate reason, once dry, controlling, analytical, is gently watered, not defeated, not denied, simply allowed to rest. Like land that has been plowed too long, finally touched by rain. Jung called this state the restoration of the Eros principle, the recovery of the connective force in its purest form. Eros is a connective principle, but when it is purified, it no longer binds through compulsion. Collected Works of C.G. Jung, Volume 9, Part 2. Venus does not bind. She opens. And when beauty opens in this way, you no longer need to remain alert. No need to follow the image. No need to remember each detail. For the symbol has completed its work. It has reminded the nervous system that safety and pleasure can coexist. If your eyelids now grow heavy, if the image begins to blur, if the voice drifts away like an echo from the depths of the sea, you are not missing anything. You have arrived. Jung once said, "The creation of something new is not accomplished by the intellect, but by the play instinct." Collected Works of C.G. Jung, Volume 6. And here, there is no longer creation in the sense of making. There is only the ancient play of the unconscious, where images come and go, where beauty does not need to be held, where sleep is not a goal, but the natural consequence of harmony. Venus does not remain upon the shore. She dissolves into the air, into the breath, into the growing heaviness of the body sinking into the bed. And as she dissolves, there is no loss. Only one thing remains, a gentleness spreading without object, without reason. We will not awaken this image again. It has done its work, and from here on the journey no longer requires radiant symbols. It requires only deeper settling, where all images slowly dissolve, making room for an unnamed wholeness. And in that settling, you do not need to go anywhere anymore. You only need to drift. Part 11. The masterpiece of individuation. And then, when the image of Venus has dissolved into the softly salted air of the night sea, when beauty no longer needs to be looked at, but only felt, a very deep stillness appears. Not the stillness of an ending, but the stillness that comes after everything has found its place. Here there are no radiant symbols left to follow, no stories left to tell. There remains only one clear sensation. Separation has grown weary, and the soul longs to rest. Carl Jung once said that confronting the shadow is only the beginning of the journey. It is where a person learns to see what has been rejected. But for Jung, confronting the Anima is the masterpiece, because here it is not only about seeing, but about learning how to live together. He wrote, "The encounter with the Anima is one of the most important steps in the process of individuation." Collected works of C.G. Jung, Volume 9, Part 1. The masterpiece Jung spoke of is not an achievement. It is not something to boast about, nor a destination to be reached. That masterpiece is a quiet union, where the parts of you that once stood in opposition no longer have to prove their existence through conflict. On this night, when you no longer need to understand anything further, Logos and Eros begin to listen to one another. Logos, the principle of reason analysis and form, releases its grip on control. Eros, the principle of connection, feeling, and resonance, no longer needs to erupt through chaos. These two principles, which once pulled you in opposite directions, now share the same inner space. Jung called this moment Hieros Gamos, the sacred marriage within the soul. The coniunctio is the essential content of individuation. Collected works of C.G. Jung, Volume 14. Hieros, gamos, is not the dissolution of one pole into the other. No one is sacrificed. No one must give way. It is a non-antagonistic coexistence where reason can remain without drying out, feeling, and feeling can rise without overwhelming consciousness. And when this happens, a sensation, both strange and familiar, emerges. You no longer feel divided. There is no longer a part that must be strong just to survive. No longer a part that must be gentle in order to be loved. No longer a part that must understand everything in order to feel safe. There is only a unified human being, steady enough to rest within themselves. Jung described this state not through excitement, but through return. Individuation means becoming an individual, a unified whole. Collected. Works of C.G. Jung. Volume 7. Here love is no longer a stage for roles. It becomes the sharing of two free souls. Not freedom to leave, but freedom without the need to bind. You no longer love to fill an emptiness. You love because something whole wishes to be given, and the most important thing returned to you at this level is truth. Not a harsh truth that wounds, but a truth that no longer needs illusion in order to exist. Jung warned that when human beings do not live in inner truth, they construct substitutes, idealization, projection, possession. But when truth is accepted, those mechanisms have no work left to do. Neurosis is always a substitute for legitimate suffering. Collected Works of C.G. Jung, Volume 16. Inner union does not erase the pain of life. It simply restores pain to its rightful place as a natural part of living, no longer burdened with distorted meaning. From there, love no longer has to perform the task of healing the soul. It returns to where it belongs, a space of encounter. If you have ever been exhausted from holding everything together, if you have ever feared that letting go would mean loss, then Hieros Gamos offers a quiet consolation when the inside has united. There is nothing truly left to lose. For what is most precious wholeness no longer depends on whether someone stays or leaves. Jung wrote, "The self is not only the center, but also the whole circumference which embraces both conscious and unconscious." Collected Works of C.G. Jung, Volume 12. When the ego ceases trying to be the center, when it learns to serve the whole. The self. Love is no longer a negotiation between two fears. It becomes a quiet presence where two people can stand beside one another without hiding any part of themselves. And at this point, there is nothing more you need to do. No need to hold the rhythm. No need to maintain a state. Union does not require constant effort. It sustains itself like breathing when the body is no longer tense. If at this moment, as you hear these words in the night, you feel a gentle heaviness spreading through your body, not sad, not joyful, simply settled, then this is the sign of the masterpiece nearing completion. Not loudly, not dramatically, just enough. Jung once said, very simply, wholeness is not achieved by cutting off a portion of one's being, but by integration of the contraries. Collected Works of C.G. Jung, Volume 14. And when the opposites have been integrated, the journey no longer needs to continue through willpower. It shifts into another rhythm, the rhythm of melting, of letting go, of deep rest. Here there is nothing left to prove. No questions that must be answered. No road that must be walked further. There is only a quiet wholeness holding you, not to bind you, but to support you. And from within that very wholeness, the final part of the journey will not arrive as a climax, but as a dissolving where wisdom no longer needs words, and sleep comes as the natural result of harmony. Part 12. Dissolving into the ocean of wisdom. And then, after the union has been completed, after Logos and Eros no longer converse through conflict, but through silent presence, a very subtle movement occurs, not a movement forward, not a movement upward, but a movement of dissolving. In this moment, the journey no longer needs a guide. It no longer needs symbols. It no longer needs philosophy. Because what philosophy has been trying to point toward from the very beginning has now become direct experience. The ticking of the clock, once a reminder of time, of responsibility, of unfinished tasks, begins to change its meaning. It no longer stands apart. That ticking rhythm gradually blends into the slow heartbeat of the universe. Not faster, not slower, just steady, like the breath of a vast being gently lulling itself to sleep. You no longer have to follow that rhythm. You are inside that rhythm. Carl Jung once said that when consciousness ceases to cling to the role of center, the human being does not disappear. They are held by a deeper order. He wrote, "In the unconscious man is in communion with the whole of nature. Collected Works of C.G. Jung, Volume 10. And within that communion, a very ancient relief appears. You are no longer an image onto which others project, no longer a container for the immature expectations of others, no longer an emotional burden carrying the weight of the world. You are returned to your rightful place within the stream of life, not at the center, not at the edge, simply a living part. Jung used a very particular word to describe this state, animated, made alive. Not alive through activity, but alive through reconnection with the primal current of life. You do not need to be someone in order to exist. Your existence itself is already reason enough. Life is a process of becoming a combination of states we have to go through. Collected Works of C.G. Jung, Volume 11. Now that process of becoming no longer requires effort. It continues while you rest. Let Sophia, no longer a guide, no longer a light, pointing the way, become a lullaby. No teaching, no instruction, only a compassionate presence, like the hands of Mother Earth gently supporting your back. Mother Earth in Jung is not a religious image. She is a symbol of the absolute ground where all opposites are held without the need for resolution. There, anxiety is not erased. It dissolves. It dissolves like salt in water, like memory when sleep is deep enough. You may feel your body growing heavier, not from exhaustion, but because there is no longer any need to hold yourself up. Gravity no longer pulls you downward. It embraces you. The bed is no longer a hard surface. It becomes a silent support, like the earth supporting the roots of a tree. Any remaining thoughts, if there are any, do not need to be pushed away. Let them pass like very high, very slow clouds. There is no one standing below to follow them. Jung once wrote a very quiet sentence. The greatest and most important problems of life are all fundamentally insoluble. Collected Works of C.G. Jung, Volume 8. And precisely because they do not need to be solved, the soul can finally set them down, not in despair, but in trust. Trust that deeper layers of existence continue to uphold order even while consciousness rests. Now the final images, if any remain, begin to soften as well. The floating roses lose their form. They dissolve into color. Color dissolves into sensation. Sensation dissolves into a nameless space. Here there is no longer you as a role, no longer I as an ego that must be defended, only life sensing itself. Jung called this state participation mystique, mystical participation in the whole, not to dissolve identity, but to rest from the effort of maintaining identity. The ego is only the center of consciousness, not of the whole personality. Collected Works of C.G. Jung, Volume 9, Part 2. And when the ego stops trying to be the center, the entire nervous system shifts into safety. The breath slows automatically. The heart beats more deeply. The muscles of the face release. The jaw unclenches. The eyelids grow heavy, not simply from sleepiness, but because there is no longer any reason to remain awake. If at this moment you no longer clearly remember what has just been said, if words begin to drift away from meaning, if only distant sound remains like the rhythm of waves, that is not distraction. That is consciousness doing exactly what it is meant to do, withdrawing. Jung once said, "The unconscious is not just evil by nature. It is also the source of the highest good." Collected Works of C.G. Jung, Volume 13. And in this sleep, the unconscious does not need to teach you anything. It simply holds you like the ocean holding a drop of water that has grown tired of maintaining its shape for too long. You do not need to go on. You do not need to complete the journey. You do not need to understand one final thing. Because the journey has ended precisely through the dissolution of the very concept of journey. From here, everything continues without a narrator, without a listener, without an observer. Only sleep arriving not as a goal, but as the natural state of a soul that has been placed back where it belongs. Sleep well, not as a wish, but as a deep permission.